A few thoughts this morning around the sermon title, The Search Committee Snow Job, and against the backdrop of that passage that we listened to, or perhaps read for ourselves as well. Let me start off with a story about a minister in a small town, and I'm not going to say whether it's in the nation he was from, because it's dangerous these days to categorize any person and anything around them. But let's say this is a minister in a small town, and he had the habit of every Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, he would leave his office and return after 20 minutes. And he did so religiously. And when he got a new secretary, after about a year of observing this, she thought, let me check on my boss. What is he doing? So she followed him, and he went to the center of town to the railway line. And he stood there, and at 5 minutes past 3, the freight train rumbled past. And he stood there mumbling, the most beautiful thing, the most beautiful thing. And she went back to the office, and he returned after his usual time that he spent there. And after some time that she got more familiar with him, she mustered the courage to ask him about his love for freight trains, and trains in general. And she was trying to, make some conversation about it. And he said, no, let me tell you what it is about. And he said, I go there every Tuesday to watch that train rumbling through. And then I mumbled to myself, the most beautiful thing, the most beautiful thing. Because it is indeed for me the most beautiful thing. Because it is the only thing in this town that moves without me pushing it. And remember that story. I'll get back to that later in the sermon. Much of the passage that we listened to, these verses from the text that we know as the second letter to the Corinthians, much of that deals with the relationship between the Apostle Paul and the congregation or the church in Corinth, one of the first churches that Paul founded. And it deals with a rocky part in the relationship. Paul visited the church, then went back for a second visit, and in that second visit, something happened. We're not exactly sure what happened, but it upset Paul greatly. So he went back to Ephesus, from where he wrote this letter, and apparently another letter that we think is lost, that we don't have a copy of. But that second letter that was lost was scholars believe a very strong rebuke, very harsh words for the church in Corinth. And Paul sent this letter, this very strong worded letter, with Titus, a co-worker of him. And I think we can pick up in this narrative, not only this passage, but through the letter of Corinth, but specifically here, some anxiety from Paul about how his rebuke was received and what the consequences would be. So Paul traveled to Troas looking for Titus. He couldn't wait for Titus to return to Ephesus. He was trying to find him sooner than that. And when he couldn't find him in Troas, he went on to Macedonia, as the passage says. There he went up with Titus, and Titus must have told him, you know, all is well. The people still like you. They're not upset with you. Everything is good. So this remorse and anxiety that Paul had, I think somewhat similar to when we hit the send button for an email, that you should have waited probably a day for us to settle down when we're angry with someone. Similarly, Paul, you know, sent this letter, and now he was greatly relieved. But my sermon title refers to this, you know, Paul writes how wonderful Titus is. Titus writes, says how wonderful Corinth is. And Paul says how wonderful both Titus and the congregation of Corinth, the church of Corinth is. It made me think of the search committee situation. You know, when you go in there, at some stage, the candidate is tired of interviews, and the church is tired of looking the search committee. So at some stage, you just say everything is wonderful, and then, you know, you appoint someone, and then later on, either the church or the minister or both of them have to dig out from underneath the snow job that they did on each other. Paul boasting about the church in Corinth. I think the most probable translation of that word used for boasting would be to say that he was proud of them and that he had confidence in them. This passage spoke to me. And I remember the phrase specifically, I boast about you. It's a rather convoluted line of argumentation that he follows, but I think he makes his point. He says everybody involved in the end came out of this for the better. They were in a better place, both him and Titus and the church. Because he says everybody involved stayed grounded in the love of God, and they did not allow circumstances and small incidents to get in the way of a solid bond of love, grounded in the love of God. You will probably not remember any of it, but in a sermon that I delivered on October the 30th, 2016, the title was A Tenacious and a Tenuous Thing. A tenacious and a tenuous thing. And I was referring to pressing issues that both involved systems, and that was greatly troubling me. And the one was the circumstances that we find ourselves in the Anthropocene, this era where there is so many people, there are so many people on our planet that we are also through the value system that we embrace and our practices influence our planet home to such an extent that it makes life tenuous. Life is tenacious. It can hang on in corners and under circumstances that is incredible, but it is also fragile. And there is a tipping point beyond which it just gives up and dies and disappears. It's involve specific species and organisms, but also systems. I also spoke and said there is, for me, some equivalence or similarity between the attack on institutions and the discreditation of our institutions in our nation that facilitates life and that makes life possible. It's not perfect, but institutions that function as systems to facilitate our national life. And the erosion of trust in them and the destruction of some of them worried me greatly. I think both those trends are still with us, and has perhaps increased, at least to an extent. I think that adds to the unsettledness and the disruption and the anxiety, discomfort that we experience with the pandemic and the direct tragic consequences of it, of death and severe illness in so many families, and financial ruin because of the illness, and also financial ruin due to the economic consequences of a prolonged situation of not being able to get out in front of it and to do what is scientifically best for us to do. I think in the next few months, the months bookending our election, upcoming election, we will experience, no matter where we are in our personal convictions on the political spectrum, more anxiety. And I think in the days to come, a community like this, church, Congregational Church of Topsfield, this community gathered now on Zoom, or perhaps on community TV, and those of you who are not members or part of our community prior to your watching on community TV or on Zoom, you are most welcome to be part of us, but I'm addressing specifically those that regard themselves as emotionally and psychologically belonging here. I think this community will become more important, and I look towards this community to generate hope for us for the months ahead and maybe years ahead, depending on what may happen on our planet and in our nation. I've shared with you my humble opinion that I think hope has to be based in reality, and that hope comes into being, among other elements that are important. Hope comes into being, in my experience, mainly through hope-generating praxis, action, behavior, practices that express a commitment to a better future. That one can do something, that you are not helpless, that you are not a sitting duck waiting for things and history to happen to you, but being actively involved in your own life and your future and the future of those around you and the ones that will follow you. It is amplified when that is done, acknowledging that we are part of a web of relationships, and it is done within the context of that relationship. On Thursday afternoon, I was in a meeting, another Zoom meeting, with my clergy group, known as the Community of Practice, the historic Massachusetts Conference, said it's good that clergy meet in groups so that they can support one another and talk about stuff that you cannot talk to your counsel or your spouse, perhaps, who are tired of listening to the church stuff. You know, just colleagues talking to each other, exchanging views, asking questions about how to do this, or what would you advise this, or just rendering support to one another. And as it is customary in such groups, there's always the check-in, you know, and we do your personal life, your family life, and then the church. How are things? And in my check-in about the church, I said, I'm actually proud of the flock. I said, I'm surprised, but mainly proud. You know, I was boasting about the church like Paul, and not as a snow job, because I didn't have to sell them anything. I was just speaking what I am experiencing and what I'm observing. I'm proud of, in spite of everything, the difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in on many levels and in many ways, that we are able, and that the membership have found ways to, in a COVID-compatible manner, continue with existing ministries and existing commitments to honor that. I'm extremely grateful for energy available and innovation applied so that new ministries are being born. And I'm amazed and I'm grateful as well, especially when I observe young families where home is no longer just home, but it has become the office. And sometimes a double office for two professionals having to share the space. There is also now, in Topsfield at least, become the school. And sometimes more than one school for different age children. Remember the story about the train. I've seen in my own experience, most often when I arrive in the place, I feel like that minister that you have to push everything. Otherwise, nothing moves. And I'm grateful to say that I don't have to push things, everything here anymore. It is indeed something to be grateful for. My intent when I arrive in the congregation is always to try and lead the people to a place where my presence becomes redundant, where I'm no longer needed, where it is a functional church and a flourishing church that can function without a minister present. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we've made good progress. The pandemic has brought its own set of crises and difficulties. And this community, this covenanted community, as I said, can be a place of hope and a place where we are grounded in the storms that are raging around us and the storms that will come and perhaps increase in intensity. It will not flourish just by accident or on its own. It will only be sustained, and it will only be sustaining us if we continue to commit ourselves fully. Because it is not yet clear what the influence of a pandemic especially will be on the nature and the long-term future of a community that is essentially based on personal contact and in-person expression of community and relationships. We will therefore have to acknowledge that it will require additional commitment from all of us, additional innovation that we are capable of and that we have demonstrated an ability for, to nurture this community so that it can be a place of hope, so that it can sustain us. Let us put the hard yards in. Let us put the hard yards in by committing anew to living the great commandment internally, without developing a selfish, inward-looking perspective and a way and a mode of being in the world. Let us walk in the footsteps of Jesus, because walking in the footsteps of Jesus always leads to higher ground. And it leads to that city on the hill, where it shines like a light in the world that cannot be hidden. So let this community not be a place for us to withdraw into and isolate ourselves from the world, but let it be a refuge where we can discover again that we are grounded in God's love. A place where we find acceptance, where compassion guides us, where we can find support for the ravages of the pandemic, of climate change, and of the destructive nature of hyperpartisanship, where we can find grounding to counter the disregard for truth and the intolerable shame and outrage of inequality in so many levels and sectors in this nation and in this beautiful land. Inequality that is harming this nation and our world, that is wreaking havoc with the additional intensity of the pandemic, inequality especially in income and wealth. Let this community especially be a place and a shining light, as we have tried to be in spite of years of extreme partisanship and an ugliness that has settled into the public discourse of our nation. Let this once more be the place and continue to be the place where we talk to each other with respect and respect difference of opinion without succumbing to being everything for everyone, but by finding common ground that is based and grounded in and on the justice that we find described in our sacred text, that is at the core of the teachings of Jesus, and that has been part of the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition since its inception. Let us be that place, and let us be that community. I'm proud of that. I'm grateful for it. May this be how we journey into the future. Amen.